Good evening, friends. Before we start, let's have a quick audio check. If you're able to hear me, if you're able to see me, then please raise your hands. I just have one hand raised. Okay, yeah, now I have a lot of hands raised. Yeah, so I'm assuming that audio video is fine. So we can pause. We'll start in a minute or so. So you can now lower your hands. Good evening, friends. Welcome to one more session on discussions related to sociological topics. So before we start, again, some of those basic announcements. If you need any guidance related to preparation strategy, the link is here. If you need any help related to answer writing, again, the link is here. Whatever we are going to record today, or whatever we are going to discuss today is being recorded, and the video will be available within 24 hours, and the handout would have been already shared with you. If you need any guidance, the mentorship number is this. Right, so let's get started. I think it's raining in most of the part of the country, so I think you're having pleasant weather after the harsh summers. And yeah, pleasant weather is there, but at the same time, other issues might be there, right? Heavy rains, traffic, and all those issues typical of most of the places in India. So, what are we going to talk about today? These are the list of topics that we are going to discuss. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about economic planning in India, right? So, for a long time, India had a particular body which was called the Planning Commission. Again, a few years back, it was disbanded, but since 1950s, we had a body which was the Planning Commission. So, we try to understand what is this Planning Commission. In fact, we'll not focus on the body as such. We'll try to understand what is the meaning of planning, right? If there is something called as planning, then there might be something which is opposite to planning. What is opposite to planning? How do countries which do not have planning as a mechanism operate? And what has been the result of planning, right? Have we been able to meet our objectives? Has planning as a mechanism done well in the Indian context? What are some of the criticisms of planning? Are these criticisms valid? And if you are disbanding planning, if you're not having a body like a planning commission, then do you need to have some other institutions who can fill up some of the roles which are still relevant? Right? So all those things we are going to discuss here. And keep in mind that topics like this are relevant from the perspective of sociology paper 2, right? So in paper 2, you have topics related to planning, mixed economy, those kind of things. So from that context, it is relevant. The next topic that we are going to talk about is the analysis of the new education policy. So sometimes what happens is, especially in sociology paper 2, you'll get questions that analyze a particular scheme, analyze a particular policy, analyze a particular law, right? So many times they're given. For example, there might be a question which asks you to analyze national rural employment guarantee scheme. There might be a question which asks you to analyze national rural livelihood mission. They might ask you to analyze something like, let's say, Jan Arogya Yojana. So this kind of policy, or understanding or keeping note of some of the important policies is important. National education policy has been in the news for some time now. Right? It was initiated in 2020, but every now and then you will find something related to the new education policy. So that is the reason understanding the policy, understanding the implications of the policy is important. Can be asked in the exam, especially in sociology paper 2. The next topic that we're going to talk about is rural kinship and caste imprints in urban areas. So many times, in fact, we would have discussed, I have talked about it, how in rural areas, caste is a more important phenomenon, and in urban areas, class is a more important phenomenon. In rural areas, you will most likely find extended families. In urban areas, you will most likely find smaller families. So this is what we have been talking about, and there have been multiple theories which talk about that. But keep in mind that when I use these kind of statements, when I make these kind of statements, I always say you are most likely to find. Or in urban areas, class is a more prominent phenomenon. I will not say class is the only phenomenon in urban areas. What is the reason for this? See, in urban areas, yes, class might be a more significant phenomenon, but that doesn't imply class will not exist. Class does exist in different ways. Similarly, you might have, let's say, more extended families, joint families, large families in rural areas. That does not mean in urban areas you will not have. Right? There might be multiple reasons, different reasons why you might have extensive kinship systems even in urban areas. So in this topic, what we're going to talk about is how some of the features which you are most likely going to find in rural areas, you find them in urban areas as well. Maybe in a different form. Maybe the reason for these kind of formations associations are different, but they do exist in urban areas as well. So recent literature and again some of these traditional studies we are going to refer here. How kinship patterns, rural kinship networks or similar to rural kinship networks, same patterns you find in urban India, how caste-like formations or how caste skill is relevant in urban areas. We're going to talk about that. The next topic is women and political participation. So here we have, so in our syllabus, you have again topics related to politics, right? You also have topics related to gender issues. So we have clubbed both these things together, right? How women are participating in politics or how women have a role in politics. But here what we will do, we will look at multiple angles. Right? When I use the term politics, again it can mean a bunch of things. Whether women holding certain political positions, or whether women voting, or whether women participating in different non-electoral things, or whether women taking up different kinds of leadership roles which might not necessarily be political issues. So we will talk about all these things. How all these things have changed over a period of time. What is the impact if more women start participating in politics? We'll talk about that. And to analyze this, what we will do, we will divide the time into multiple parts. Right? So we will look at the scenario before independence. Right? What was the position of women in politics? After independence, what is the position of women in politics? We will again divide politics into different parts. Right? Women participating in voting, women trying to hold different positions, women participating in active political life, bunch of things. We will take all these things and we will analyze what is the status right now. And this particular discussion will also have some of the recent research on women and political participation. Now, why I'm including all these recent research? See, in mains examination, sociology paper 2, many times you will get questions which are very contemporary. In sociology paper 1, you will get all these static questions as well. I define this. What is the difference between these two things, like that. But in sociology paper 2, you will get questions about, explain how these dynamics are working out in the Indian context. Explain how this scheme is working in the present context. Explain how different castes are participating in social life, political life. So very contemporary kind of things. So it is always important if you have some recent research, right? If you have idea about some recent research. How can you get an idea about some of these recent research? Maybe you read a lot of these things. Maybe you are referring to EPW, or maybe you are reading some of the journals. But the problem is you might not have enough time for all these things, right? You are doing so many things together, right? When you're preparing for UPSC, already there are so many things. On top of that, some of you might be enrolled in some colleges, some universities, some of you might be working. You don't have that much time. So in that case, what is the other option? Go for summaries, right? Maybe someplace you'll find summaries, or the discussions that we're having in classroom. Right? I will try to summarize as much as possible. You just have to refer to the summaries instead of you yourself going and finding all each of this research. The last topic that we're going to talk about is cultural lag. A very static kind of a topic, but very relevant in the present context as well. So what is this theory of cultural lag? What do you understand by culture? What is this theory of cultural lag? What are some of the implications of cultural lag? What are some of the criticisms of this particular theory? Right. So it has been asked again and again, and not just a direct question. Many of the phenomena that we see right now can be explained with the help of cultural lag. So that is the reason understanding cultural lag is relevant. So let's get started. So the first topic that we're going to take up is economic planning. So I thought I'll share a photo with you. So again, one of those photos of the Planning Commission, right? So you can see Jawaharlal Nehru at the center, and one of those photos of Planning Commission from the past. In fact, you can Google photos of Planning Commission, how Planning Commission functioned at different points of time, how the composition of Planning Commission is changing over a period of time. Every 5 years, right, you used to have a Planning Commission. So this is basically a photo from the 1950s, right? At this point of time, Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister, and he would have been the one who would be heading the Planning Commission back then. So as we are talking about economic planning, we need to understand what is the meaning of economic planning. So economic planning refers to planning for social and economic development, or in other words, the state would play a proactive role in deciding about what, how much, where, whom in the economic and social activities of the system. Now, what do you mean by this? So it is the state which is deciding all these things. So state is now having a significant role to play in the economy, in the society. So what Planning Commission used to do? Now, if you have to understand, or if you want to get an idea what Planning Commission used to do, what you can do is you can just Google it, right? You can just Google 12th Planning Commission report. Now, what will happen is, if you Google it, you will be directed to some website which will be having some archives, and they will have these reports. And if I'm not wrong, the 12th Planning Commission was the report that was there was 3 documents, and all these documents, if you print it out, it will be like this thick. So basically 3 documents which are this thick, and all these documents will basically talk about what all needs to be done in different sectors of the economy. When it comes to healthcare, what needs to be done? When it comes to education, what needs to be done? When it comes to India's exports, what needs to be done? When it comes to industries, what needs to be done? For agriculture, what needs to be done? So they used to have all these things over there. And how did they decide all these things? So for every 5 years, a particular Planning Commission will be set up, and they will decide what are the total resources that the economy has. How much of these resources can be augmented further? How much of these resources will be diverted for different kinds of use? So all these things the Planning Commission used to do. But again, how much the Planning Commission used to control these things, it would have varied from time to time. In the initial years, in the 1950s, the role of the Planning Commission would have been different, and the role of Planning Commission in late 90s, early 2000s would be slightly different, because again the economy is changing, and the role of government is also changing. The role of government when it comes to economy will change. But keep in mind that in the initial years, the state used to have a huge control. It was the state which used to decide all the different activities. In fact, the state will decide how much an entrepreneur can produce something. The entrepreneur does not have enough say. I'll give you examples. Mr. Bajaj, right, who manufactures, Mr. Bajaj, who is the owner of, he recently expired. So this Bajaj automobiles, right? So there was a huge demand for Bajaj vehicles at some point of time, Bajaj scooters. You might have seen those advertisements. Buland Bharat ki Buland Tashveer, right? So those advertisements. Now, how much or how many units of these scooters Bajaj can manufacture, that the government used to decide. And you won't believe that if you wanted to order a Bajaj scooter, you will be, you'll order it now, but you'll get it maybe after 15 years. So that kind of waiting list used to be there. So just think of it, right? There was massive shortage in the economy. The government used to decide how much an entrepreneur can produce. And it's not that Mr. Bajaj could not have produced things. He could have, but the government will provide different kind of restrictions. The assumption was whatever resources are there in the economy, it is kind of limited, right? So the government used to decide that what is the top priority maybe, and we need to divert resources for those activities. Something else can wait for now. So planning implies that you decide. The state is deciding, not you. The state is deciding whatever are the resources, how it can be utilized. So there is massive control, right? What, how much, where, whom, all these things were decided by the state. And again, it was done through the institution of Planning Commission. At this point of time, in the beginning, and to a large extent continues even now, you have what is called as the mixed economy. So you have the public sector, you also have the private enterprises. Private sector is also there. See, so many of our goods and services are provided by the public sector. In fact, till recently, airlines are also managed by the public sector. And public sector manufactures a bunch of things, right? From steel to oil to, in some cases, they might also be manufacturing soaps. Like a state like Karnataka, they have public sector units which are manufacturing soaps. So you have public sector enterprises, you also have the private sector, right? So you have what is called as mixed economy. Now, for both these things, can you imagine a scenario where you don't have planning? Can you imagine a scenario where possibly you don't have mixed economy? I'll give you an example. See, in this what happens, the government is deciding, right, how the resources can be allocated. But you might have a different economy where it is the market players who are deciding. Basically, you have some consumers. The consumers have demand for different kinds of goods and services, and the market players, they provide for all these goods and services. The government has some role, but it need not have this strong role. Right? The government might come into the picture when it comes to regulation. It will ensure that the private players are not taking advantage of the consumers, maybe. Right? So some regulation will be done by the government, but the government is not deciding how much resource an entrepreneur can use. Government is not deciding what an entrepreneur should manufacture, what an entrepreneur should not manufacture, how much of it can manufacture. Those things the government might not do. So an opposite of planning is that, right, where you do not have this kind of a control. The market players are the ones who are playing a significant role, and the state has some role to play. Primarily, it is for regulation. Opposite of mixed economy, both public sector and the private sector are there. Not necessarily opposite. Another kind of model can be the public sector's role is minimized, right? Public sector is not there. Maybe in some areas the public sector plays a role. For example, let's say national defense, law and order. Most likely all countries, even if you go to a capitalistic country, there also when it comes to national security, law and order, it will be provided by the state, by the government. But most of the other sectors of the economy, it is provided by the private players. So at present we have mixed economy, and we are also going towards privatization, liberalization. The role of government in providing for different kinds of goods and services has gradually gone down after 90s. But before that, there was a huge role of government. Look at the number of public sector units that used to be there. Also another thing, sometimes our planning was also referred to as democratic planning. Now, what is the meaning of democratic planning? So the aim here, the idea here, is to achieve a high and sustained rate of growth, a progressive improvement in the standards of living of people, eradication of poverty and unemployment to lay foundation for a self-reliant economy. So this is what they are saying. At the end of the day, whatever planning you are doing, it should ensure that people are becoming better off. Poverty is going down, unemployment is going down, people's standard of living is becoming better. Right? A democracy is at the end of the day a form of government which is basically representative of the people. Right? People are themselves choosing their own representatives who are governing them. So this is what is the meaning of democratic planning. But all these things that we are talking about, planning and all, Is it something which came only after independence, or was there some historical context to it as well? Now, if you look at pre-independence India, there were certain reports, certain committees, certain writings, which also were kind of plans, or which were suggesting that we should have some form of planned way of development. Now, some of the initial writings that you'll find, people like Dadabhai Naoroji, R.G. Dutt, M.C. Ranade, see, they had written a lot about the status of India's economy, and they were all trying to find out what is the reason why India's economy is not doing well, or why India's economy might have suffered. And some of them actually gave suggestions. What should be the way out? If you remember, if you have studied your history, if you've done your history lessons, you remember Dadabhai Naoroji talked about the drain of wealth theory. How because of British rule, wealth is being drained out of India, and he's also talking about some of the ways by which this can be addressed. So, some prominent Indians, they are trying to identify some of the social and economic problems that India faced at that point. Apart from this, there were also some prominent Indians back then who are suggesting what sort of mechanism India should use, what sort of plan India should have. One of those prominent personalities back then was M. Vishwasariya. Engineers Day is celebrated on his birthday, right? So in 1934, M. Vishwasariya, he is coming up with a suggestion. He's drafting a 10-year plan, and he's calling it Planned Economy for India. So this is what M. Vishwasariya does in 1934. Then in 1938, a national planning committee is set up under the chairmanship of Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1944, interesting thing is happening. There were some prominent industrialists in Bombay, right? So they are coming up with a plan which is called as the Bombay Plan. And they are now suggesting what should be the development plan for India. And why this is interesting is, see, planning is something which is usually associated with communist countries. Planning is usually associated with socialist countries. Planning is generally associated with the fact that the state is now going to have greater control. So, Bombay Plan is being suggested by industrialists. Now, industrialists, they would rather not have a lot of the state control. But they are the ones who are coming up with a plan which is called the Bombay Plan. Again, if you are interested, you can go through the details of the plan. But again, one of the criticism is whatever they are suggesting, that would have basically ensured that they continue to have a dominance. New players might not be able to join in, right? So, in a way, they would have been benefited to a large extent. So, whatever the case, another kind of plan at that point of time was the Bombay Plan, suggested by some of the leading industrialists back then. Apart from this, in 1944, some people came up with the Gandhian plan. It was based on the Gandhian philosophy. What is Gandhian philosophy? It is based on decentralization. Right, so they're talking about decentralization. Gandhi used to talk about how we should have more cottage industries, how we should focus on having self-reliant villages. It is kind of opposite to what is the present notion about economic development. Present idea will be about having more cities, because cities are the engines of growth. But Gandhi at that point of time had a different viewpoint, and some people adhered to that. They came up with what is called as the Gandhian plan. The focus here was on ensuring that the villages remain sufficient. They have everything with them. As a result of which, people don't need to migrate to cities. Everything will be there within those small pockets. Apart from this, the communist leader, Mr. M.N. Roy, he came up with what was called as the people plan. So usually communists, their agenda will be slightly different. Their focus will be on the working class, those who are the agrarian labor class. So he's coming up with what is called as the people plan, and the emphasis was on agricultural and consumer goods industries, right? And the focus was on ensuring collectivization and setting up of different state-owned industries, right? So state should have a significant role to play. People should have a significant role to play. Now this is kind of opposite of market-led economy. In a market-led economy, it is generally those who are the industrialists, right? They will play a significant role. They are the owners of different modes of production, and they play a significant role. Here, what he's trying to say, there should be collective ownership, or the state should play a significant role. So here itself, you can observe how there were different kinds of viewpoints back then. Right? You are having communist-led plan, you are having industrialist-led plan, you're having an engineer who's talking about certain plans. Gandhian philosophy of decentralization is there, and I'm just thinking about it, right? Variation in ideas and viewpoints are there back then. So what happened? India is becoming independent, and then two bodies are being set up. One is the Planning Commission, right? It is being set up in March 1950, and keep in mind it is set up by a resolution of the government. So it is not being set up as a statutory body. It is not that Parliament is creating a law to set up Planning Commission. That's not what is happening. It's not that the Constitution is getting amended to set up a Planning Commission. That is also what is not happening. So by a government order, this body is being set up. Why I'm talking about this? Why I'm putting emphasis on this? See, if you look at our Constitution, you have certain bodies. So those bodies which are set up as per constitutional provisions, these are called constitutional bodies. Now, these constitutional bodies, since they are set up through the Constitution, ideally they should be given more weightage, right? They should be having a given high pass. But here, what happened later on? A body that is being set up by a government order, that became very powerful. Planning Commission is actually becoming very powerful. And there were certain constitutional bodies, for example, the Finance Commission. There used to be a rift between the Planning Commission and the Finance Commission. Finance Commission is set up by the Constitution, while the Planning Commission is by a government order, right? So that is the reason I'm talking about it. And not just the Planning Commission, another body was also set up, the National Development Council. Now, the National Development Council, again, it is also through a government order, not through a constitutional amendment, not through a law by the Parliament. And the power of the National Development Council was even more than that of the Planning Commission. So Planning Commission used to come up with these 5-year plans, and these 5-year plans used to go to the National Development Council. The National Development Council used to decide whether these plans should be implemented or not for the next 5 years. Right? So this is what is happening. From now onwards, right? From 1950 onwards, you now have planning commissions for every 5 years. There have been some points of time, there have been few years where you had a plan there, maybe because of some exigency, some emergency. But by and large, you have had these planning commissions and they have come up with their reports. The last planning commission that we had was the 12th planning commission, right? So this is how things look like. And again, the 12th planning commission was disbanded, and in place of that 12th planning commission, you had the Niti Aayog. Now it is kind of the right time to evaluate how successful was the planning commission, what were some of its achievements, and what were some of its limitations, what were some of its drawbacks. Now, if you look at its performance, let's do one thing, let's look at its achievements. Now, it was supposed to ensure rapid growth of the economy. It was supposed to ensure that people's standard of living improves. It was supposed to ensure that unemployment goes down. All these things the planning commission is supposed to do. How far was it successful in these regards? Now, if you look at the first 50 years of the 20th century, right, 1900 to 1950, at this point of time, you did not have a planning commission, you were under the British rule. So, at this point of time, in these 50 years, the growth rate of Indian economy had actually gone down. So, our per capita incomes used to fall. That was the case. But from 1950s onwards to 2000s, early 2000s, this trend was definitely reversed. It's not that our per capita income fell down. Rather, our per capita incomes gradually increased. Also, our growth rates have gradually changed, have gradually improved over a period of time. So, if you look at the data, from 1950 to 1980, the growth rate used to be around 3.5% per year. In 1980s, this was around 5.5% per year. In 1990s, the growth rate was 6.5% per year. In 2000s, it was around 7.6% per year. So gradually, the growth rate has increased. Again, you might have a counterpoint here that yes, we might have a higher growth rate, but we should have had even more high growth rate. Yeah, again, this can be valid. I'm not denying that. We'll come to that. But the thing is, as compared to what was the scenario before 1950s, you are seeing a sustained increase in the growth rates. Another major achievement, if you look at the last 50 years of the 20th century, has been in the area of food security. Before 1970s, right, India was not a food secure nation. India was dependent on other countries for its food requirements. It did not have enough food grains. In fact, it was dependent on countries like USA for its wheat and other things. There was a PL 480 program by US, and India was one of those major recipients of that program. So you did not have enough food with you. In later part of 1960s, different kind of policies were initiated. Green revolution is one of those instances. And after that, we have become the food secure nation. Yeah, it's a different question whether we took into consideration sustainability aspects or not, but we definitely became food secure. And again, I'm not saying we are a nutritionally secure nation. Food security and nutritional security, they can be two different things. But we have enough food grains now. In fact, we have so much food grains now that we are exporting food grains outside. And our storage facilities are, again, some of them are overflowing with food grains. So that is again a major achievement that we have had in the last, during the planning commission period. Also, the poverty rates have gone down. Whatever was the extent of poverty in 1950s, definitely it is way less. But yeah, could we have had a faster reduction in poverty? Yeah, maybe we could have had. But poverty has definitely gone down. Apart from that, if you look at different social indicators, there also India's performance has definitely improved. In the 1950s, if you look at the fertility rate used to be around 6. Now the fertility rate is below the replacement levels, right? So that is what we have achieved. If you look at other indicators, population growth rate, at some point of time, the population growth rate was very high. But now, at least in the last couple of decades, what has happened? The population growth rate has consistently gone down. Infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, in all these cases, the numbers have gone down. But yes, there can be a question whether we could have done even better, right? We have done better in the last 50 years of that 20th century, but maybe there's a scope for having much more improvement than what we have achieved. So these are some kinds of achievements. But at the same time, there are different criticism, drawbacks of the effectiveness of the planning commission. So what are some of the criticisms? First is, one of the major criticisms is maybe the growth rate could have been better. Maybe, and see, what you can do, you can actually compare how much they had projected, how much each plan document, right? Each planning commission would have come up with its own report. So they would have projected that, okay, for the next 5 years, we'll have this much growth rate. And then you know what was the growth rate. You'll find that there is a massive variation. So they have not been able to match up to their own projections, right? So the actual growth rate and the targeted growth rate, there is a variation. Similarly, poverty has gone down, but now also we have not been able to eliminate poverty. Now also, some 29.5% of the people are under poverty. So poverty has not become zero. What about unemployment? Unemployment continues to be one of the major concerns. At the end of the 12th five-year plan in 2017, India's unemployment rate tends to remain high. And there has been different kinds of criticism, specifically for the period after 1990s, that the focus has been on economic growth. But the way you have gone ahead with that, it is primarily capital-intensive growth. So economic growth is happening, but it is more capital-intensive. What does that imply? The focus is more on capital-led growth, which implies that you are now focusing more on mechanization maybe. And as a result of which, the growth has not been labor-intensive. As a result of which, what has happened? Employment has not increased. So employment elasticity of growth is low in case of India. What does this imply? If growth is happening, it should ideally create more jobs. It should ideally create more employment opportunities. But in case of India, growth happened, but employment was not created, which indirectly implies that overall, the economy did well. Per capita incomes on an average, it increased, but the number of jobs did not increase. So this is something which is a major cause of concern. So capital-intensive growth. Now, inequality has not gone down. One of the philosophy of planning is that resources should be distributed uniformly. But the benefits of economic growth has not been distributed equally. Some have got benefited more, others have not. Then there are different kinds of regional imbalances which continue. Some areas in India will have top-class facilities. Some other places will not have. Some places in India will have very good infrastructure facilities. Some other places will not have. Some places are doing exceptionally well when it comes to different socio-economic indicators. Other places are not. So regional imbalance is there, and our method has been more centralized. Right? It has not been bottom-up approach. Planning Commission is one body which is at the central level, located in Delhi, and they are deciding for the entire country. So they are deciding what kind of resources will be required in Mizoram, what will be required in Kerala, what will be required in Jammu Kashmir, what will be required in Tamil Nadu. So at one level, right, far off, you are deciding that okay, all these things are required for these places, or these things are not required for these places, and then you are deciding how resources will be allocated. But see, maybe those who are deciding over there, maybe they don't have enough capacity, or maybe they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough technology to make the decisions. And in fact, making the decisions might also not be easy. So maybe a state like Kerala needs something, a state like Himachal needs something else, but you are having one common approach for all these places, so might not work well. And also there has been a criticism that when you have these kind of institutions, federalism also gets impacted. Ideally, the states and the union, right, they should be equal partners. But when one body is deciding, one body again which has been created by the union government is deciding how resources have to be allocated, it gives more power to the union and less power to the state governments. Right? So imbalance is there when it comes to the federal pass. So all these are different kinds of criticism of the planning process that India went through. Now, another kind of criticism is criticism of planning as a mechanism. Till now, we have been talking about the criticism of planning in India. But planning as a process, it itself can be criticized. Or there are some commentators who criticize that. Basically, there are two kinds of criticism of the process of planning. One is planning is something which is like statism. States should have high role to play. So planning implies excessive intervention by the government in economic matters. If the government is deciding what Bajaj should produce, government is deciding what Reliance should produce, why should government decide in economic matters? There are people who want to have scooters. There are people who want to have something else. Why the government will decide whether they should be eligible for scooters or not? Government is entirely deciding that, right? If government is saying that Bajaj cannot manufacture scooters, and it is saying that Bajaj can manufacture something else. So the demand supply what is there, it is getting impacted. So some people will criticize this on these grounds, that there is statism, there is investment planning. Why should government involve in investment planning? Another kind of criticism is, see, look at other countries. They did not have planning, and as a result of which they are doing so well. India had planning, and as a result of which India's growth rate was not beyond a particular point. Right? So this kind of criticism can also be there. Maybe India should have followed a different trajectory, and as a result of which its economic growth, its economic trajectory would have been way better. Now, how far these two criticisms are valid. Right? So let's look at each of these criticisms one by one. So the first one about investment planning, right? So keep in mind that yes, India did do that. Right? Initially, that was the case. The government used to play a very significant role. They used to decide how different resources will be distributed, what the private players can do, what they can't do. But all these things in the later years were gradually disbanded. In fact, this licensing regime that was there, government used to give license. That okay, you have the license, you can produce. If you're not getting the license, you cannot produce. You need licenses to produce a particular quantity. But all these things was gradually disbanded. It was gradually diluted. So in its pure form, that investment planning was there in the initial years. Later on, it was not there. So again, just criticizing all these norms might not be correct. The second argument that other countries are doing well and they did not follow this trajectory. Maybe India could have done well had it not followed this trajectory. Now, this criticism might also not be completely fair. Why? See, the development trajectory of a country depends on a host of factors. One of them could be planning, but then there are other factors at play as well. Political factors, cultural factors, social factors, all these things are there. Multiple factors are there. Many times people will compare India with Japan, saying that, oh, Japan, after the World War II, let's look at the scenario, the nuclear bombs were dropped in Japan, despite that they did so well after that. Right? So they built an entire country from scratch, and now they're one of those most industrialized countries. And they'll compare it with India. But people are forgetting that Japan was actually industrialized before that as well. Japan had a very high literacy rate even before they were born. In case of India, that was not the case. Look at India's society, look at India when it comes to different social indicators. India's literacy rate was very low, 11% when India became independent in the 1950s. And India was not at all industrialized in the 1950s, very few industries. So all these comparisons that are there might not be correct. What is rather important is, or what can possibly be done is, maybe look at India, maybe do some sort of modeling, economic modeling, and find out where India could have reached without planning and compare it with where India reached. That makes more sense rather than having all these cross-country comparisons, because there are a host of other factors at play. So these two major criticisms are there, but again, these criticisms have their own shortcomings. So we now have an idea about the planning process, what were some of the achievements, what were some of the shortcomings. We also have, to a large extent, a decent idea about the criticism of planning. Now the question is, as the planning commission has been disbanded for some time now, do you think there is a need for somebody which can take up some role, which planning commission did, which might be relevant in the present context? So what are some of the functions that might be relevant? The first is, you need to possibly have a shared vision or a commitment to the national objectives. And what should be the goal of the nation? 10 years down the lane, 20 years down the lane, 30 years down the lane. Right? So this is something which might be relevant. So even if you're not having a planning commission, if there is one body which tries to think about it, right? What should be India's industrial policy, or what should be India's economic situation, status, maybe 20 or 30 years down the road, it might be beneficial. Apart from that, the economy is changing fast, the technologies are changing fast. At the global level, all these things are changing fast. So it makes sense to track one's progress from time to time. Right? You need to understand some of these trends. You need to understand where we are heading, what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the dangers, what are some of the threats. So maybe having one body which consistently follows these, which consistently earmarks, right, which consistently compares India with all these changes might make more sense. Also, there are certain kinds of things are important. They should be national priorities. For example, poverty alleviation. For example, having some basic health infrastructure throughout the country, having some basic amount of education infrastructure throughout the country, education levels throughout the country. How do you do that? So somebody which can take care of this, ensuring that minimum levels of services are throughout the country. And how do you do that? What kind of policy should be there? What kind of tools should be used? Maybe those kind of functions need to be taken care of. Now some bodies do that. And for example, finance commission will try to do that. Finance commission will have some mechanisms for this, but maybe some other body which can take up this thing. Also, right now, you don't have a lot of forum where you can have intergovernmental bargaining. Right? So state governments and union government both have their powers, draw their powers from the constitution. But usually what you find in case of India, the union government tends to have higher powers maybe. So is there any forum where this kind of bargaining takes place? We need those kind of institutions as well. So maybe have an institution which carries out this. Previously, planning commission was one of those forums where this was happening. So these are some functions that possibly need to be replicated. Maybe you have to find out some bodies which can take up these roles. So this is about planning, limitations, what are some of those things which still continue to be relevant, and what are those things which should be taken up. So let's look at one question here. Examine the issues involved in development planning in India. Analyze how establishment of Niti Aayog helped in removing limitations of planning commission. So intentionally this question has been given to you. Planning commission, I mentioned, it was disbanded recently, and instead of planning commission, you have one body which is the Niti Aayog. So as a homework, you have to study what is Niti Aayog. Is Niti Aayog having similar kind of powers as planning commission? It is not. Niti Aayog is mostly a think tank. Niti Aayog basically carries out different kinds of research, and it comes up with different kinds of studies, and it tries to again promote cooperative federalism, to some extent. So what are those things which are lacking in the planning commission? How Niti Aayog is doing that? So the handout that has been given to you, it has some basic framework about Niti Aayog. It also talks about some issues with Niti Aayog. So look at that and compare it with planning commission, right? So kind of an assignment for you so that you yourself take it up. So this is one question. Now let's move to the next part. Analysis of the new education policy. And before that, if you have any questions, I can take it up. Yeah, some people are having issues with the audio. I'll try to be louder. So Niti Aayog is a think tank. Planning commission was not a think tank. Planning commission was actually deciding how resources will be distributed between the union and the state governments, and between the states also how the resources will be distributed. Niti Aayog doesn't have any say over there. Yeah, those who are asking questions about the handout is already there in the portal. There's one question: is it required to know about each and every planning commission? No, it's not required. Nandini says, why planning commission turned into Niti Aayog? Planning commission did not turn into Niti Aayog. Planning commission was disbanded and a new body was created, which was the Niti Aayog. So again, all those limitations that we talked about, right? And on top of that, planning is usually associated with socialist countries, communist countries, right, where you do not have market involvement. But in case of India post-90s, we have been moving towards liberalization, globalization, etc., right, privatization. So again, our economy has changed. Again, maybe it was thought that you don't need a planning commission right now. Okay, so next we will try to understand a recent policy, the new education policy. Some of you might have already listened to it if you have, some of you might have already listened to a part of it if you have been attending the social justice lectures related to education. But yeah, what we'll do is we'll just look at some components of the new education policy, but our focus will be on evaluating the new education policy, right? What are some of those things which are interesting? What are some of the things which will work? What are some of the things which might not work, right? Or how can you make a policy better? When you analyze something, you look at both the things, right? Positives and negatives, and what can be done to make it better. So what we'll do is we'll first look at the features, and then we will go for that critical evaluation of each of the components. So what is this new education policy? What all it talks about? Before that, keep in mind this particular word. What is policy, right? Or what do you mean by this new education policy? See, a policy is basically a kind of a vision document. Right? The government would have planned or would be thinking, right, how this particular sector should look like over the next 10 years, 15 years or so. So from time to time, the governments usually come up with some vision document. Right, okay, these are the things that we should have ideally, we should aspire to have ideally. So new education policy implies that what kind of educational system we should have, what kind of education structure that we have. So next 10 to 15 years, what kind of reforms we should have, so that we meet the demands of the economy, we meet the demands of the society. We have had other policies as well. In the past, we have had policy for women, we have had policy for the electronic sector, IT sector. So all these things will have these long-term aims. But that does not, and again, these are just long-term aims, and it does not imply that whatever they're talking about will get implemented. If they're saying that we will restructure education, that does not mean that education will automatically get restructured from the date it is getting published. No. For all these points to become effective, you again have to have new laws which will implement that. So this is just a policy. And again, it is up to the government when they're going to implement all these things. Like some of these things they might start considering, some of these things will get implemented in a year or so, some of them might not even get implemented, or some of them might be implemented in the long term. And keep in mind, it's not that for the first time you're having a new education policy. In 1968 you had one, in 1986 you had one, and again now you're having one. And some of the things that were suggested in 1968, 1986, they have not been implemented even now. Right? So we should always look at a policy from that perspective with a pinch of salt. Some of these things can get implemented, some of these things will not get implemented mostly. So what is this new education policy talking about? So I'll quickly go through some of the provisions. So first thing it is saying is we need to restructure our school curriculum. At present, what kind of structure generally we have? 10 plus 2, right? Standard 1 to standard 10, and then 11, 12. In some places it is called college, in some places it will be called pre-university, in some places it is called class 11, 12. So they're saying this kind of structure you don't have. Rather have 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. So from 3 years to 8 years, and then that should be the first 5 years, then 3 years, then 3 years, then 4 years. Divide this like this. So here it is just 12 years. Now here it is basically they're focusing on 15 years, right? 5 plus 3 is 8 plus 3 is 11. Yeah. So 15 years of education, which indirectly implies they are focusing on early childhood care and education. At this point, usually when we talk about education, the focus is on those who are above 6 years of age. But now what they're saying is we should start focusing on those who are in the age category 3 to 6 years as well. Why? Because new evidence suggests that a large part of brain development, cognitive development happens at an early stage. So if there are kids who are able to access education at a younger stage, right? Those who are in the age category 4 years, 5 years, it helps in their brain development, which in turn helps them understand different concepts, absorb different concepts when they are in standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, etc. So if there are kids who are not going for preschool education, who are not getting all these interventions, their cognitive development will be different. As a result of which, there will be learning gaps over a period of time. So to address for those learning gaps, why not focus on early childhood care and education? And who is going to provide for that? Again, they're saying Anganwadi workers can provide for it. If there is already a school out there, right, primary school is there, maybe you can have some more classrooms over there which can provide for preschool education. But keep in mind they're not very clear here, right? Who's going to provide for it? Whether you should have hire more Anganwadi workers, whether Anganwadi workers should be trained more. So all these things need to be sorted out. When it comes to training of Anganwadi workers, they're talking about some certification that they will provide. But whether more Anganwadi workers will be hired, whether they will be paid more, all these things are not covered here. Next thing they're talking about is how do you ensure that education is inclusive? How do you ensure that education is universal? Universal means everyone is having access to education. Those who are the marginalized communities, they are not excluded from education, they should be included in education. So they're talking about that. And they're saying that some communities, some sections of the population, they are usually excluded. They need to be included. Females might be excluded from education. Transgenders might be excluded from education. Those who belong to the scheduled caste community maybe, those who belong to the minority community maybe, they might be excluded. Those who are in the rural areas, they might be excluded. Those who are from the poorer sections, they might be excluded. Those who have some form of disabilities, children with disabilities, they might be excluded. So you have to find out ways by which they can also be included. They do not drop out of education. They continue to remain in education. And they're saying that we need to have counselors, social workers who can play an important role. You need to have a gender inclusion fund so that you will prioritize girls and transgenders. They can also be part of the education system. Have some special education zones. In case there is one area where there are certain marginalized communities or there is concentration of certain marginalized communities, have declare that area as special education zone and have concerted efforts over there. Right? So we are talking about all these things for universalizing education, for making education more inclusive. Now, another thing is, a lot of Indians, they would have completed their schooling, but they don't even know basic sums, basic arithmetic. They don't even have basic literacy skills. They can't read things. There was one study which found out that, in fact, this was a ASR study, Pratham study, those who are graduating from 8th standard, if 4 kids are graduating from 8th standard, one of them cannot even do the reading, the math sums, which is second standard kid is expected to do. So you are passing 8th standard, but you can't do things which a second standard kid is able to do. So there is a need for achieving foundational literacy and numeracy. Basic numbers you should be able to understand. Basic mathematical calculation you should be able to do. Basic reading you should be able to do. So what they're saying is we should have a mission mode approach, and by 2025 you should ensure that everyone has these basic skills. They're also talking about a national book promotion policy. People should have access to different kinds of books. Curriculum needs to be changed. It has to be updated. Usually what happens, our curriculum is full of things. Right? You have to remember a lot of things. It incentivizes rote learning, and you are supposed to study multiple things. Multiple subjects will be there. Generally in 8th standard, 9th standard, you'll be having some 11 subjects. Do you need that many things? In fact, in the present scenario, most of the information is at your fingertips. Use your phone, you can get any information. Google, you will get information. Why do you need to remember all these things? Rather, in this present age, you should be able to make sense of so much information out there. You should be able to analyze information. You should be able to criticize things. So critical thinking, discussion, analysis, all these are more important. So ideally, your curriculum should promote that instead of being just overloaded with factual information. Then they're also talking about the medium of instruction. They're saying that the medium of instruction, again, ideally it should be the local language, at least till 5th standard. The advantage here is the child, if he or she is a first generation learner, can easily understand whatever is being taught in the school. So ideally have it in the local language or the mother tongue. And again, they're saying that you should go ahead with the 3 language formula, and choice should be given to the states or the students. When it comes to assessing the performance of students, nowadays what happens? Usually you have the board exams, and board exams will be in standard 10 and standard 12. It's once in a year kind of thing. It creates immense pressure, and just look at the outcome, right? Do you need those things? How much are 10th board exams relevant in your career? I mean, I don't even remember how many of my friends or people around me using those board exam results. So they're saying maybe we need to have some reforms over there, and they're saying that you need to have some agencies for assessment. National testing agencies, products. So they're talking about these things. And ideally, the board exam should provide more flexibility. Right? They should test some of the core things rather than all these structural information. People should have more flexibility to write exams multiple times a year. So these are some recommendations when it comes to school education. Similarly, there are some recommendations when it comes to higher education. At this point, if you look at the data, very few students in India, or very few people in India go for higher education. The gross enrollment rate tends to be somewhere around 26-27%. Right? So those who are in the age category where they should be going for higher education, hardly 26-27% are going for higher education. This needs to be increased to 50%. Another suggestion is the kind of education institutions that we have. It can be categorized. Some institutions, they should focus primarily on research. Some education institutions, higher education institutions, they should focus on teaching and they can carry out some amount of research. And then there should be some institutions that should focus on just giving degrees. I mean, yeah, obviously they will also teach and they will also do some assessment, but the focus should be on giving the degrees. Because not everyone would want to pursue a specific career in that discipline. They just want a degree maybe. Some of them might want to pursue it at a higher level. Some of them might want to carry research. So have all those kind of categorization, and the policies can accordingly be targeted to different institutions. They're saying that we need to focus on multidisciplinary education. At present, education is compartmentalized. Right? If you are studying engineering, within that again you will be studying mechanical engineering. Some of you will be studying chemical engineering. Some of you will be studying electronics engineering. If you are studying sociology, again you are just studying sociology. You might not have any idea about economics. If you are studying economics, you are just studying economics. But in real life, whatever problems that you see, it requires some form of interdisciplinary approach. All the inventions that you see around you, they are a product of disciplines interacting with one another. So in the present world, multidisciplinary approach is very important. So they're saying education should focus on this. Accordingly, you need to have different kinds of programs which promote this multidisciplinary education. When it comes to regulatory structure, again they're saying that we need to have multiple bodies doing regulation. Don't have one body which does all the things. So there should be different bodies with different functions. Some should be ranking institutions, giving them ratings. Some should be setting standards. Some should be creating policies. Some should be giving grants. Right? So that way there will be checks and balances. One body should not be there which is having all the powers together. So some changes in the regulatory structure are also required. So apart from this, they're saying that we need to focus on research. At present, India's spending on research is very low. Right? We spend somewhere around 0.69% of our GDP on research. Look at countries like South Korea, Israel. They're spending more than 4% of our GDP on research. Right? So Indian higher education institutions don't spend enough on research. They're saying that we will set up a national research foundation which will have a corpus of 50,000 crores, which will be investing in research. Also, we need to have more foreign universities participating in India. More foreign universities will ensure that you have new technology, you have new curriculum, you have better teachers, better standards. Also, it will ensure competition with the domestic education sector. That way, the education sector will be better. And how will you do this? They're saying that we will make rules regulations which are will ease rules regulations so that foreign players can participate in the Indian education sector. And lastly, our education is not practical oriented. It's more theoretical in nature. So vocational education needs to be integrated at the school level. If you look at countries like South Korea, 96% of the population goes for vocational education. In case of India, this number is hardly 4%. Right? So vocational education needs to be promoted, and how do you do it? Maybe integrated in the school curriculum. So these are all different kinds of recommendations, suggestions that are there in this planning, that are there in this new education policy. Now the question is, how good are these suggestions? Right? Or can they be implemented? Or are there some issues which can prevent the implementation of all these things? So let's try to evaluate each of them one by one. So first thing, they're saying that we should now have early childhood care and education. But they're saying that maybe the Anganwadi workers will take it up. Now keep in mind, Anganwadi workers at this point, they have different activities already, right? Nutrition status of women, health status of pregnant lactating women. They also take care of children over there. On top of that, you want them to provide for early childhood care and education, right? So the efforts that they're going to put will be more. We don't know whether they have the capacity to provide all these things. And again, this particular policy lacks the clarity whether every Anganwadi or pre-primary learning center will be equipped with all these teachers or workers, whether you are going to hire more of these Anganwadi workers. There's not much clarity here, right? So ideally, there should be more clarity. Or else again, how do you implement this? Next thing, they're saying that we have to focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. By 2025, everyone should have at least these skills, right? They should be able to read, they should be able to do some basic arithmetic sum. Now, what is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of this foundational literacy? They're saying that basic text someone should be able to read. But how do you define what is a basic text? Ideally, there should be a definition of a basic text, which is also lacking. They're saying that we need to have a national book promotion policy. People should have access to books. But different sections of the population, different communities, different age categories, they will have their own specific requirements. How will you have something like this? Or how will you cater to something like this? There is variety of demands, right? How do you cater to that? Again, this is something which is not very clear here. Also, there's a mention of ensuring that education is universalized, ensuring that education becomes inclusive. And here they have mentioned that we will be having social workers, we'll be having counselors, right? Those who are from marginalized communities, they need some specific guidance. But again, the policy does not specify how many social workers are required. It doesn't specify how many social counselors are required. What should be the ideal ratio between counselors and students? All these things are not there. How will they be recruited? Right? All these things are not there. Also, when you say you have to universalize education, that means everyone should have access to education, which also implies that all those issues that are there, which prevent people from acquiring education, which prevents people from children from accessing education, that needs to be tackled. For example, a lot of kids get married at a very young age. One of the primary reasons why children drop out of education is child marriage. Another reason why children drop out of education is because they engage in different economic activities. Right? They start working, child labor. And all these things are by the way legal violations. So there is not much clear mention of how do you address these legal violations, which actually is preventing universalization of education. There's not much mention of that. So ideally, there should have been more clarity. When it comes to the curriculum and pedagogy, again there are some questions raised here. For example, when it comes to the usage of the local language, ideally the local language should be used for providing education till 5th standard. This is what they have mentioned. But again, there's no definitive decision here. They're saying ideally it should be the case, but they have not said that it is something which is mandatory. Right? So there's no definitive decision here. Apart from that, they have said that use different kinds of pedagogical methods. In fact, the policy talks about different kinds of pedagogical methods. It talks about inculcating values and a bunch of things. But you have a list of these pedagogies, values, etc. Many of these things were already there in some documents before. There was a national curriculum framework way back in 2005. It also mentioned these things. That okay, these are the different ways by which education can be imparted. These are the different values that should be imparted. So ideally, if you have had something in 2005, between 2005 and 2020, you should evaluate it. Which pedagogies are better, which pedagogies are not. Which values should be imparted, which values should not be imparted. And the refined list should have been included here. So what is the whole point of including all those things which were there in 2005 in another document 2020? Ideally, some form of selection should have been done here, right? Some form of screening should have been there, which has not happened. Apart from that, when you're saying that you should impart education in the mother's tongue or in the local language, now, it might be difficult in some scenarios. Just think about Adivasi children. Adivasi children, their culture might be different, their language might be different. They might be staying in a particular locality where predominantly the language is different, right? So they're staying in a region where the local language is different, their own mother tongue is different. So how will you impart education to Adivasi children, right? So they might not be able to understand whatever is the local language over there. Also, The new education policy says that whatever Indian knowledge systems are there, try to integrate it with education. Yoga and other things, try to impart all these things, try to integrate yoga and other things with your education system. Now the problem is, many of the educators that we have, they are not good at the basic things, right? They're not able to impart the basic things. On top of that, you're asking them to impart all these things, and they might not be skilled enough to integrate all these things. So again, it might lead to a situation where anything is being taught. When it comes to testing and assessments, there is a suggestion that you need to have some more agencies, national testing agencies, etc. Now, if you are having more organizations, it will just lead to increase in bureaucracy, right? Over-regulation will be there, which we possibly don't need. One more suggestion is, see, as per the Right to Education Act, there should be an educational facility or school near human habitats, right? So within a particular radius, there should be. Now, what is the problem here is, since this was the norm, every child should have a right to education, so he or she should have easy access to different education facilities. So within a short physical distance, there should be a school. And what it has led to is a situation where there are many schools, but many of these schools do not have sufficient number of students, and it becomes very difficult to have so many teachers for each of these schools, which has very few students. So new education policy says that instead of spreading your resources thin, why not disband some of these schools which have very few students and have one complex where you have all the schools, right? It has primary education, it has early childhood education, it has secondary education, everything will be there in that school complex. So this is what they have suggested. That way, resources will not be spread thin. Now the problem here is, we're assuming that people have access to mobility. Affordable mobility is there, right? So there is better communication, transportation facilities, which might not be the case. So if you are talking about having school complexes, you also have to think about these mechanisms. Otherwise, again, children will not be able to access education. Another issue, in fact, the last point. So they're saying that we need to have equitable and inclusive education, but you do not have any time-bound goals. There are no action points. It mentions that we should have a culture of inclusion, but again, there is not much details here. Female students might face different specific issues. There might be concerns about safety, sexual abuse. All these things are not part of the new education policy. Apart from that, there's no clarity on role, appointment, budgets, ratios of social workers, special educators, and counselors. Right? So they had mentioned that we will have special educators, counselors, which will be helpful for the marginalized communities. But all these details, right? How much money will be spent on them? What should be the budgetary allocation? All these things are lacking. So the new education policy has a bunch of interesting suggestions, right? Bunch of things which can help the education sector, but at the same time, there are so many of these things which are not having enough clarity. And if you're not having enough clarity, implementing this becomes a challenge, right? So these are all different issues when it comes to the new education policy. So when you are asked to evaluate something, talk about the positive things. At the same time, talk about some of the challenges that might be there. Again, if you know the challenges, you can also suggest ways by which you can address these things. For example, school complexes, you're talking about mobility is an issue. Maybe have better infrastructure facilities, maybe have better mobility facilities. It can be a solution. So that way, you can think about this entire sector. So question. It is argued that the new education policy is just lip service and difficult to implement practically. In this background, briefly discuss the salient features of the new education policy, strengths and limitations of the new education policy. Right? So you can easily answer it. We talked about the features, we talked about some of the positive points, and we also talked about some of the issues. So all these things you can put it together. 200 words, you can answer it. Features will take maybe maybe around 80 words. You can talk about the features. Then you can talk about the positives for let's say 40 words, and then you can talk about the issues for the remaining 80 words. Right? So easily you can answer a question if you have gone through all these dimensions. And these are all more factual kind of thing, right? Recent event, and on the basis of that, you are doing an analysis. So now let's move to the next topic,